in this section of notes, we're going to look at the idea of a confidence interval. What does that really mean? So we're going to start with that you use a confidence interval to make an estimate of what you think the true value of some proportion or mean might be for some population. And you're going to give it as an interval. So you're going to say, I think it's between these two numbers. The way you're going to do this is you're going to do some sort of a sample, and whatever you get in your sample, either the sample proportion or the sample mean, that's going to be what's called a point estimate. And then you're going to have a margin of error. Now, there is a formula for margin of error. We'll come back to that in a later section of notes. But that is essentially like how far off from the true answer do you think your sample answer might be? So, for example, if I did a survey to ask what proportion of people are going to vote for presidential candidate A, and in my sample, 20% of people said they were going to vote for this person. And then my margin of error, maybe it was 10%. So my estimate plus or minus margin of error would be 0.2 plus or minus 0.1. And then when I added and subtracted, when I subtracted, I'd get 0.1. When I added, I'd get 0.3. So my confidence interval would be 0.1 through 0.3. Now, the confidence level is how certain you are of your answer. So, are you 95% confident that the true answer lies in between 0.1 and 0.3, or are you 80% confident that the true answer lays in that interval? So, these are two really important sentences. You're often going to be asked to interpret either the confidence interval or the confidence level. And they're basically just both some fill-in-the-blank sentences that you're going to give me. Sort of like earlier in the year when I asked you to interpret the mean or interpret the standard deviation. There was a certain format that you always gave your answer in. So in the example I gave you previously, for interpreting the confidence interval, I might say something like, we are 95% confident that the interval from 0.1 to 0.3 captures the actual value of the proportion of people that will vote for presidential candidate A. So the C is going to change. That's going to change with your confidence level. The two blanks are the endpoints of your interval, and then you give the context of your problem at the end. For the confidence level, you're basically going to be changing that percentage value. So what percentage of confidence you have. And again, we'll talk about that later. Typically, that's something that's going to be given to you in the stem of the question. And then you do have to add some context to it. So you might say something like, if we were to conduct many samples of the same size from this same population, about 95% of those intervals would capture the true proportion of people that will vote for candidate A. Just a few more things here to add to your notes. This formula is the formula that is on your formula sheet for finding a confidence interval. Again, we don't know a whole lot about this yet. You kind of know what a statistic is. We're going to talk about critical values in some point in the future. And you know what the standard deviation of the statistic would be. Well, it turns out when you multiply those two things together, that gives you your margin of error. Something else you should be able to do, for example, in the problem I gave you earlier where I said my interval was 0.1 to 0.3, you should be able to look at an interval like this and you should be able to work backwards to figure out which number was in the middle. So the number halfway between 0.1 and 0.3 is 0.2, so that meant that my point estimate was 0.2. And then you should also be able to look at an interval and say, okay, now that I know what number's in the middle, how far away are the endpoints from that number in the middle? So both 0.1 and 0.3 are 0.1 away from the middle point at 0.2. So you should be able to look at an interval and kind of work backwards and figure out what number went here and what number went here. A few other things to note. There are some trade-offs. So your margin of error depends on the standard deviation of the statistic, and it depends on the critical value, and the critical value depends on the level of your confidence. So there's a couple things you'll see. So if you want to increase your confidence level, or in other words, you want your interval to capture the true value more often, then that means you're going to have to increase your margin of error. The other thing you could do if you wanted to try to narrow that interval, so think about it, you would really like to find the perfect balance of you want to be correct, but you also don't want to give an interval that's so big that it's not useful. So another thing you can do is if you increase your sample size, that will decrease your margin of error. And one last thing, margin of error basically is just a way to account for sampling variability. So you know that every time you take a sample, you're going to get a slightly different answer. So you can't just say, oh, I did a sample and my answer was 0.2, so the true answer is 0.2. When you know that you're going to get a slightly different answer every time, that's where you're going to say, okay, I got 0.2 as my sample. I bet the true answer is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.3. So that interval that you're creating is based on sampling variability. One thing to be careful of is that margin of error does not account for bias. So if you just do a poor sampling method, or you have a survey that has biased questions, that's not margin of error. That's something else. That's like back in chapter 4 when we talked about how to do a survey well or how to do it poorly. That would be bias. Now, don't forget to try the practice problems from these sections before moving on.